Welcome and thank you all for attending the Risky Business webinar series for cyber risk assessors. We really want to thank you all for being with us today. Your host today will be Philip Robich, cybersecurity risk analyst, and Chris Logan, Senior Vice President and Chief Security Officer at Sensinet. The webinar series is intended to help speed up your work, stay a step ahead of bad actors, get the credit you deserve for protecting your organization, and develop the right set of skills to catapult your career in cybersecurity. The Q&A chat is enabled for today's webinar, and we look forward to addressing your questions at the end of the webinar. And all the slides will be shared with you at the end of the webinar in the communication that will follow. So with that, I want to welcome everybody. And now, Philip and Chris, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Saul. And first and foremost, thank you, everybody, for attending today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to, have a conversation and dialogue with us. You're seeing a lot more activity from the standpoint of government enforcement. And what you're going to continue to see is that as these events continue to happen and organizations are impacted by breaches or outages, there's going to be much more, recognition or much more of I'm missing the word. I'm sorry. There's going to be much more of a detailed look into organizations about what they're doing and how they're starting to solve for these problems. There's another issue that we're faced with as an industry, though. There's an absolute shortage and talent gap that's taking place. The demand for cybersecurity workers is at an all-time high. And now we're not alone in this fight as an industry. Every industry is having this issue right now. There's just not enough talent in the cyberspace to go around, and we're fighting an enemy that works a lot better than we do. But there's hope here, and I want to continue to share this message of hope, and I think we're going to cover some of this later on. And then more importantly, we've seen the attack surface just completely expand by leaps and bounds. And it's not just in one place within the organization. It's going to be in a bunch of different places, which is going to be something we're going to take a close look at right now. And if you think about this from that risk perspective of enterprise risk, there's going to be a lot of different areas where we're focusing on an ever-growing landscape of enterprise risk. Critical is that clinical risk, right? First and foremost, patient outcomes, length of stay, quality of care, patient mortality. These all get tied into the cyber lens now. Again, as I said before, we've digitized. So what's happening when we digitize is that we're now branching further out into that patient care continuum. That drives new operational risk as well. If you think about outages and what cyber means from an organization, ED diversions and transfers. If I don't have my systems available to take in patients, I now have to send them someplace else. That may cause care operations centers to close. IT systems being offline is going to disrupt that supply chain that you have. And what about financial risks, right? That now implements lost business. Now we're starting to see a shift in more litigious actions taking place with class action lawsuits from people who have suffered losses with that advent of ransomware. More importantly, the financial risk that we see from a healthcare perspective, when you think about insurance premiums, it's not the same game as it was before. Cyber insurance premiums constantly are increasing to a point where they're almost unattainable for healthcare systems. So it really, really ups the ante there and allows organizations to look at this from a financial risk perspective and start to make some other decisions. Then what about other risks, right? So if you think about this from that perspective, if I have losses that are in my business, both operationally, from an IT perspective or clinical, there's reputational damage that takes place. So how am I supposed to solve for these problems if I'm also having or suffering from reputational damages? That also drives in to this concept of regulatory risk in geopolitical events. Now, one important element, and I see the slides just advanced, by the way, that had nothing to do with that. One important element of all this is that what you're also starting to see is that now that IT incident, that threat landscape is now not just impacting your organization, it's actually having a direct correlation and impact on the region. So if we have an outage in our health system, now I have to deal or I have to understand what that impact is to the other health system and care delivery organizations that are around me. So this is incredibly important if you think about how you're managing your risk today from an enterprise perspective, how that trickles out and could harm the folks that are in your geographic area. And there's no shortage of new cyber attacks as a direct threat to patient care. If you think about what we've seen over the course of the past few years, it's only escalated itself. My slides aren't advancing, by the way, even though I'm advancing them, just to let you know. So we'll figure that out on the back end. So we looked at this, and the shortage of news that's out there. The recent FBI director declares ransomware attacks against hospitals a threat to life crime. And I don't think that he's wrong when he says that. You know, we actually went out and did an assessment or a survey with the Ponyman Institute. And one of the things that we were looking to understand was, what impact does ransomware attack have on your organization, on patient care directly? And you can see the results that we got back. Now, I will say this, that we don't have direct correlation here or causation. This is all correlation, right? So people's observations of what ransomware attacks did, what cyber events did within their organization, played out in this capacity. There could be that increase in patient mortality. There is definitely an increase in patient diversions and transfers, longer length of stay. These all have impact directly to patient outcomes and could have a direct impact to that mortality of the patient. But there's hope. And what I want to say is that there's a rallying cry that we can get behind, because cyber safety, if we frame this the right way, truly is patient safety. Now I'm going to pause for a second because I've already done a lot of talking. And I want to introduce Philip, because I want Philip as our resident assessor here to really share that vision about what should we be doing as cyber risk practitioners to really drive this message across the enterprise. So Philip, you're up.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Chris, for kind of like leading us to up to this point already. As you said, the really important part is we want to carry this message up through the organization. So it's not only the risk assessor that needs to know about the cyber risk issues, but it really needs to go all the way across to the upper management, so that everyone is aware and that everyone has total visibility. In order to have total visibility, of course, we need the proper reporting. We also want to have a place where any automation can help us scale our efforts. What I mean by that is essentially want to have a centralized place where you can track remediation efforts or risks that have been identified. And then with that reporting piece, you want to have like a dashboard or a risk register where you can actually communicate that risk that has been identified through this assessment all the way up through the organization, and not only for like a particular vendor or assessment, but really like across the board about your entire vendor portfolio and the entire risk posture, to see where are my open remediation findings, how can I mitigate them, how can I communicate that through the entire enterprise, and how can we move forward. Now, this applies kind of for both ends, right? For the vendor assessments that we conduct on third parties, but it also applies to our own assessments that we conduct on our enterprise. As we just learned, essentially, that cyber safety is patient safety. And it's really important that you not only address the risk of your third-party vendors, but that you also address the risk of your own enterprise, your own organization, to see that you're in a good posture here as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Important takeaway here, right? We're talking about taking cyber and making it an enterprise risk, making it risk aware across the entire enterprise. And I love this quote from Chris Inglis, who was the former national cyber director. And he stated, like, if you're an adversary in this space, and specifically we was talking with healthcare at that time when we were having this conversation, you have to beat all of us to beat one of us. And this resonates. And the reason why it resonates, and it's so important as this topic as we're having today, is that if we're escalating that cyber risk to the rest of the enterprise and the organization, that risk now gets classified as that top priority. And if we're all working together in harmony within a single organization, it's going to be tougher to beat us. But what if we take that and expand that beyond the walls of our healthcare system, and we start to create this rallying cry and lock arms together with other healthcare delivery organizations? It's going to be tougher for that adversary to beat us, because we're all working in the same direction. We're rowing the boat in the same direction. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. And what we're really talking about here, excuse me, is the 10 best practices for managing enterprise risk as that enterprise view, right? So we're going to walk through this, and these build upon themselves. I'm going to take the first few because this is my background, right? The compliance, cyber hygiene, program maturity, those are my bailiwicks. I'm going to bring Philip in to talk about the blocking and tackling that takes place after we get that phase done. So let me jump right in and talk about maintaining system-wide HIPAA compliance. So this slide here, when we talk about compliance, it's the building block, right? It's a foundation for our program. And really what we're looking at it from is this perspective is that this is what we have to do as an organization. So when I think about HIPAA, or I think about compliance in general, what are the pieces of the puzzle that I have to put in place in order to be successful here? Does not just correlate back to me as an organization, me in the IT department running with this. I have to get others involved in this process. So when I think about mandating risk assessments here to maintain compliance, I need to leverage a couple of things. One, automation. I need to scale my risk assessments and understand my risk across the entire organization, ensuring that all entities have been a part of that assessment or that process. More importantly, as I get all entities involved in the compliance program, I now need to automate some of those action plans. Look at what my gaps are to start to close those gaps, centralizing what that visibility of the overarching risk is or the compliance view, and rolling that up so that the highest levels within the organization see the pieces of the puzzle we need to put in place to maintain our compliance. More importantly, this starts to set a framework. So now if I'm thinking about that concept of what Director Inglis said on the previous slide was, to beat any one of us, you got to beat all of us. Now I need to take what I've learned from that process and start to share that, with those organizations around me, like organizations, so that we can benchmark against each other, ensuring that we're maintaining the highest posture of compliance standards. Now, as I come into this next view or the next slide, right? So I've started to build my program on compliance. So if you could advance that slide, thank you. Go back 1, 2, 3, couple. You jumped too far. I apologize. So go back to the slide that, nope, you're too far forward. What? Yep, right there. Ah. I apologize for the technical difficulties. For some reason, my machine is not allowing me to share the slides, so I'm working with a third party to advance those slides. So I apologize. So improving cyber hygiene. Now that I've built my foundation for compliance, what are the things that I'm doing to effectively improve my cyber hygiene across my organization? Now, here's the important aspect of this. As I'm thinking about cyber hygiene, it's not just on the risk assessor or even the IT or the cybersecurity arm of the organization to manage and maintain all the cyber hygiene. Again, taking the enterprise view is now we're expanding that beyond the walls of just IT and bringing it into other parts of the organization, whether that's networking in the data centers, the endpoint security teams, all the way out to our governance and compliance folks and friends, right? So we're really looking at this lens from a much wider view and making people understand what their responsibility is when it comes time to dealing with cyber hygiene. Another area that's very important here, if I think about improving cyber hygiene, I want to go back to Public Law 116321. So back in January 5th, 2021, HHS put this rule forward and it's signed into public law that looked at recognized security practices, right? Be taken into account if there was ever a breach of your organization. Those recognized security practices were HICCUP, so the healthcare industry cybersecurity practices, as well as NIST CSF. Those were named, they were recognized in that guidance. These are voluntary. And the reason why they're voluntary is because it's not a one size fits all, right? It may not work for your entire organization, but it creates a blueprint, a roadmap for your organization to start to attain a certain level of cyber hygiene, which can then be replicated and benchmarked against your peers to understand where you're standing in regards to in getting all these practices put in place. What's most important though, and this goes back to tying it into compliance, is that I can demonstrate coverage for at least 12 months. That may allow me to have mitigation of fines, results in early favorable terminations of audits, or mitigate remedies that the HHS Office of Civil Rights may bring down. But again, these are building blocks to create that enterprise view of cyber. Finally, what we'll talk about is elevating your cybersecurity program maturity with the NIST CSF. So now that I'm worried, I got my compliance, I'm rowing the boat in the direction to get compliant. I've worried about my cyber hygiene. Now, how do I mature my program using NIST CSF? Well, I won't go into great detail about the NIST CSF. I'll just give it to you in brief. Just industry standards, recognize best practices, really helps organizations demonstrate and manage cybersecurity risk. It's multiple functions, multiple categories and subcategories. There's a lot going on in the NIST CSF. But what's important about this program, it allows you to complete an enterprise self-assessment view. We want organizations to understand where they stand. More importantly, it enables you to build in evidence capture and centralize some storage on the SensiNet platform, and then automate that action plan. Again, thinking beyond the scope of what a normal assessment would be for a risk assessor, I'm now taking bits and pieces of this program maturity, this maturity program, right, with the CSF, and I'm subbing it out to other parts of my organization for their subject matter expertise. So it's not me answering the questions, it's allowing other people to influence and determine the gaps that we have as an organization. What's most important about all three that we've already talked about, benchmarking again, but generating audit-ready reports, having that enterprise view, rolling it up to that top level, and then being able to hand it off. The next phase of this, as we're building upon it, and this will be the last piece that we talk about in the cyber realm as far as it relates to compliance, hygiene, and program maturity, is really now starting to drive benchmarking against your peers to drive continuous improvement. So when we talk about benchmarking, we're really comparing performance, coverage, and maturity to others. We're going to identify and close gaps and controls with policies and procedures, then prioritize. What are we allocating from a budget perspective? Where am I putting additional resources? How much workforce do I need? We're justifying the investment in the program, not just within the IT department, but the larger enterprise, right? So how do we do this is we look at the work that's been done with NIST CSF and HICCUP benchmarks and what we're doing from the HIPAA security rule and privacy rule from a compliance perspective. Bring those all together with cost and productivity benchmarks and roll that information up. Automate those action plans again, so you have this complete coverage or this roadmap about where your program needs to go. Remediate the tracking of what you said you were going to do and put timeframes and assign folks to getting that work done. And then finally, not only build in the evidence capture and centralize it in one location, but be prepared to report. Get audit ready, report those summaries up to the board for greater coverage. So that was a lot. Now I'm going to take this next slide and we're going to look at how we're automating those action plans to close critical security gaps. And now we're auto-generating those, right? Now that we have that enterprise view with compliance, with hygiene, with standards, how do we now get that out into the enterprise to make people more aware and make people understand what their responsibilities are? So I'm going to pause. I'm going to and hand this back over to Philip to talk about closing critical security gaps and automating action plans.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Chris. So as we come to this section of the assessments where we go to our corrective action plan, let's say we received the questionnaire back or we completed our self-assessment and we now want to track these remediations or even figure out what these findings are. Now, without built-in automation, it is really difficult to just, or impossible really, to auto-apply any findings and see where do we need to work on. Now, what we've done with the SensiNet platform is that based on a given tier that you assign to the assessment, you can auto-populate findings. So for example, if you want to look at any like critical or high insights based on the use case or based on the scope of this assessment, you can now auto-generate these findings. So instead of having to look at each question and then create the finding yourself, which you can still do, but now with that feature, we can really automate and streamline that process. And within 1 or 2 clicks, we can generate this whole list of findings that we can now look at and work through and see, okay, which ones are applicable for our organization, how like we can make any adjustments, like, for example, the priorities of those, or if we want to include anything in a contract. So we have a lot of like flexibility here. But the most important thing about this is that we have one place where we can track all the remediation together. We can identify all the findings that are ongoing in this assessment. And now I can track them, and I can even collaborate with subject matter experts. That we will go into more detail in the next slide, I believe. But what I want to say here is a lot of times, for example, there are different areas within the review phase, and it is super helpful if you have the ability to assign it to different people within your organization in order to really get the due diligence done and have the experts for each subject that can talk about that and review that information essentially. And this overall, of course, does strengthen the cybersecurity resiliency, because now we have a place where we can track all the remediation findings. We can submit them to the vendor or internally and say, like, okay, here's the findings that we found for our enterprise. We need to make certain improvements in order to strengthen our cybersecurity posture overall. So this place is perfect to get all that done.
Yeah, and I agree. And I can't stress enough what Philip already said. I think as far as the collaboration aspect of it, this is where it really starts to take cyber and put it into the enterprise. We're making people much more aware of what their responsibilities are, and we're able to close gaps as a team. And when we look at it from a team perspective, that's when the magic starts to happen. So tracking it in one central location, collaborating with those subject matter experts really allows us to think about how we get much more resilient as an organization. Speaking of getting more resilient as an organization, what about automating enterprise-wide collaboration? Now, I just hit on this, right? I'm a big fan of getting more people involved, right? In some cases, you say more hands in the cookie jar is not a good thing. In this case, it is, especially if it's identified threats and risks, straight marching orders to end closure, to close those gaps. So, Philip, in your experience as an assessor, especially, as a Sensinet assessor, we do this quite frequently, but your experience as an assessor, how are we taking advantage of collaboration across the platform to elevate cybersecurity risk into an enterprise risk?
Yeah, so as mentioned previously, there are different areas or subjects, right, that we need to address within these assessments and the findings that come out of it. Now, for me as a risk assessor, I have a general understanding, but a lot of times there are like different things that go further into like privacy, like things like around contracts, right? That would be like more for the legal department to handle. And as we talk about these different objects, like if we have like a bigger team in the back end that has like the expertise in these different subjects, I can now collaborate with them and reach back out to them and say, hey, I'm not quite sure how this function or subject works for this part, but you're an expert in this. Let me send it over to you. You complete that, send it back, and we can move forward with the overall assessment. Now, the great thing about the Sensinet platform is that our integrated role-based access account lets you create these subject matter experts, and you can assign them to see only essentially that subject that you assign to them. So you can assign to them certain subjects within that assessment that you want them to look at. They can provide their feedback on that, send it back over to you, and I can continue with my review. And therefore, we can just assure that we do our best due diligence, that we all work hands-on together as a team and make sure that we tackle this cybersecurity risk overall in the healthcare industry.
Yeah, and I'm going to go back and stress something that Philip said. Ensuring the right risk goes to the right person. Right. And I think that's what makes it truly an enterprise collaborative exchange at that point. Again, as a risk assessor, even in my early career, there were things that I just was not privy to within my organization. I was given my task, my job to go out and get this assessment done. I can't make a recommendation based upon something that I have no purview or overview of, right? So having the ability to collaborate across the enterprise and really start to think about who owns what piece of this puzzle ensures that we're, one, meeting the measure of what we need to do from a compliance, a hygiene, and a framework perspective, but also it saves us time. It gives greater visibility and overview and allows the right person to effectively mitigate and manage those risks that your enterprises are seeing.
Absolutely. And to piggyback onto that as well, before we jump to the next one, I've encountered that many times in the past 3.5 years that I've been conducting risk assessments where I had to go on internal calls or other calls and just get this information that I need. But now with this automation included here in the platform, it's a simple share via one click. They can provide me the information I need, and there's no need to find a time that works for everyone, schedule a meeting, clarify everything, go back and make those changes. So as Chris said, a huge time saver here as well.
Yeah, and again, these are building blocks, right? So I think about the maturity aspect of any organization. You have to build upon these steps, right? To really get people involved in the enterprise risk that's taking place, really get that purview and that visibility seen across the entire enterprise. That's why it's so important, as we focused on those first front areas, is that getting the house in order, now expanding it out to a wider breadth and depth of people really starts to solve the problem. So if we're automating those risks and holding people accountable for it and getting them involved, that now gives us the opportunity to branch. So when you think about risk from an enterprise perspective, and I talked about digital before, how it's so pervasive across your organization, what about non-technical vendors, right? Really starting to think about this from the lens of, yes, digital's here, they're part of the supply chain. What about the remaining factor of the supply chain that we have to start addressing? And it should be no surprise to anybody. The largest breaches that we saw in the past 2 years up to this point have been supply chain vendors. It was not IT specific vendors. Printing and mailing vendors and a dental benefits manager, yeah, there's some components of data exchange that take place there, but now's the time, as you grow that program and think about it from an enterprise perspective, it's not just cyber that's the problem. How do we get into the non-technical side of the organization and really think about strengthening the supply chain? It can only be done once we start to automate those findings and get the subject matter experts involved. Then we can start to dig and dive into strengthening the supply chain. So Philip, here I come again. I'm throwing that ball back over to you. In your role as an assessor, how have you seen this evolve at your time at Sensinet here? Where have you really been able to start to dive into the supply chain side of the enterprise risk equation?
Yeah, I can never stress that enough, about really like time is essential, right? Like the time it took previously from other processes that are utilized with other organizations, it just took a long time to conduct a risk assessment from start to finish. And that's generally speaking, it's impossible to kind of go through your entire vendor portfolio if you have a very manual process that just holds back. Now, the only solution, and I've seen that finally improving ever since I started with Sensinet, really is having that built-in platform automation, having everything centralized in one space. Now we can really speed up that time, get the assessments done way faster. And overall, this allows us now to really not only look at these critical IT system vendors essentially, but really also like on a broader level, the non-technical vendors, because as we just established, the largest breaches typically are from non-technical vendors, and they do pose a huge risk. Now, the only way we can assess them is by having a streamlined automated process essentially. So I've seen a huge change since I started with Sensinet. I'm seeing a lot of healthcare organizations conducting way more risk assessments than they have previously. So there's a great uptick that you can see or improvement in the process overall, and that goes hand in hand with, of course, taking a look at your own enterprise risk as well, communicating it through the organization, getting the different subject matter experts involved, and have the right due diligence in order to get it done properly, right? So yeah, ever since I started with Sensinet, I'm still blown away to this day how easy and seamless the process can be and how efficient it can be, right? And then the next big thing is, and that's a whole nother discussion, is the power of the network, how you truly can benefit from that as well. And again, it's all as Chris keeps saying, it's all building blocks. It all builds up on each other, and the better you can streamline the process and take benefit of the whole network, etc., you can essentially get more assessments done and tackle your entire vendor portfolio.
Fantastic. And here's another key takeaway with this as well. As we think about moving not just cyber up to the enterprise and thinking about non-technical vendors that we're assessing, the risk exposure itself. So I'll tell you, we, at any point in time with the health system diagnosis, we had what I would consider 2,000 to 3,000 IT vendors. That's a lot. You do have those, they're out there. How many, when you start to dig into this, how many actually sit on the other side of the fence in the supply chain? Normally it's about 10x that, because you're doing business in a lot of different places with a lot of different subcontractors. Think about the PPE or the services that you take in for your healthcare organization. Those components of understanding that risk, critically important to your enterprise. What if your laundry provider doesn't exist tomorrow because they were attacked on a cyber front and they can't send those new linens to your organization because they don't have that listing of what you were supposed to get? right? So you really have to start thinking and framing this conversation or this problem a little bit differently, because it creates a whole new bunch of risk for your organization. Not just the ones that we're presenting here on the slide, those do exist, but they have trickle-down effects as well. And when you get to this point and your supply chain's not available, think about the regional aspect of that. If I don't have my resiliency built into my supply chain program, will I be able to take care of patients? How do I then deal with if I have to divert those patients? What kind of harm will that cause my organization, not just financially, but from a reputational perspective and even from a legal perspective? So this is a big piece of the puzzle. But again, those building blocks necessary to incorporate this, that overarching enterprise risk program. Now, we talk supply chain, we talk the building blocks. What about organizations now that have different functions, cross-functional areas, parts of the organization that are taking on risk that maybe not visible within the enterprise risk program, or even in some cases, the cyber risk program? I think about organizations now that are developing their own apps, right? Think about that construct for a second, how it's interfacing with patient care. What is actually under the covers running there? What risk does that bring? And who owns that risk at the end of the day? Is it IT? Maybe. Is it the business unit that has charged with developing that application? Probably, right? But again, it's about bringing those two worlds together so that each of those parts of the organization truly understand what the risk is. Now, the other side of the coin, one of the things that we're focused on is IRB, so that institutional review board and research that's being done. IRB does a really good job of handling what I would call the protection of the clinical trial subject, right? That human subject matter. What about the data? Because now we're gathering a lot of information in this space. There could be nuggets of truth or gems within that data that could be used against an organization. So again, I'm going to pause. I'm going to throw this back to Philip because I want him to share his experience about what he's seen with assessing the risk of internally developed or even projects within the IT sphere that bleed into the enterprise, and how IRB and research ties into that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So again, very important that we not only look at the outside, but again, the inside. And a lot of times like internal applications and projects are kind of like overlooked because it's like, oh, we do it ourselves, right? We should be fine. But it's very, very important that you actually take a deep look at it and conduct a regular SSDLC assessment as well as pen test on your own internal applications as well as projects. Now you want to, for example, see if there's any like security measurements that you can improve in the development and as well as in the process, but then also develop policies and procedures for the internal apps on how to use them, how to fix them, how to update them. I mean, there goes a lot into this, and identify the risk that comes with it. Now, after we identified the risk of like any internal application or project in general, it's not only the internal risk, but it's also the compliance, right? We want to make sure that we assess the HIPAA compliance at all stages for not only the entire organization, but again, any internally applications or projects that are being developed. Now, this also go hands in hand, like Chris already mentioned, for IRB or research, because you also need to kind of train your stuff on the appropriate IRB on data handling process on how to handle that data. Then auto-generate the action plans, kind of like we mentioned earlier before, after you conduct that risk assessment on that IRB or research, to make sure that you create these findings and you have like one place where you can track them and follow up with these action plans and make sure they actually get remediated. Now, again, tying back into what we said earlier from our building blocks, right? The assigning remediations to the subject matter experts to actually get the correct input from the people that know most about that subject overall. And then make sure you have strong data encryption, of course, because that research data has a lot of important sensitive data in there that really shouldn't be leaked anywhere. And then, of course, also monitor the adherence to make sure that any ethical or regulatory requirements are met, just like with the internal applications with assessing the HIPAA compliance to make sure that we are compliant in that way as well. So again, it really all ties back into any assessment that we want to conduct, no matter if it's on a third party, if it's internally on our enterprise, or as we just saw here, going into actually internal developed applications or projects, as well as IRB and research. They really all go hand in hand and tie back together into that same process.
And it's interesting. I keep hearing a key theme, and I keep saying it too. So I'm going to take some credit here, right? It's getting people engaged and involved in the process, allowing them to understand what their responsibility is. This does not fall onto a single individual, single part of the organization. It's truly a team and collaborative effort. The more people understand what their responsibility is, whether it's that business unit owner thinking about how they can use an internally developed application to better engage with patients, and what all that feature and function is and what that risk creates, the more they get the aha moment about what it means to the organization from not just a financial, but potentially a clinical and a patient safety issues. And that goes to the same side as IRB and research as well. Best intentions, looking for cutting edge solutions to real world problems. Another side of the coin for that real world problem is that where's the responsibility lie when it comes time to understanding the risk that's involved? Again, IRB has done a great job. Every IRB that I've ever worked with truly understands the risk to the human subject. We're taking it 2 steps further, making them aware that in this digital economy, this digital world that we live in, that they also have a secondary responsibility to understand what enterprise risk means when it comes time to dealing with the data involved with those research projects. Now, we're building. We've kept building. We're doing a good job building. We're addressing compliance, hygiene, cybersecurity frameworks, automating corrective actions, really starting to drive subject matters into the process so they know where their responsibility lies or provide their valuable feedback. Then we're taking it into different types of assessments within the organization so that people understand across the supply chain how important it is from a non-technical perspective, and then driving it down into things that we're developing or projects that we're running in IRB and research. So we're now taking an enterprise view. What do we do with it? Well, from our perspective, we really start to build this up into centralizing and managing what we would consider an enterprise risk register. And in our world here, it's not just IT risk that we're looking at. It's risk across the entire board. What's important here from this? Not only are we centralizing this repository for all our third-party risk, we're now combining those enterprise risks in as well. We're going to provide the capability for findings and remediations and assign those across the enterprise so people and individuals know what their responsibility is. And we're also going to, in this risk register, really start to bubble up what's the exposure rating for my organization? Really look at it from the lens of what's the likelihood that something bad could happen? What's the overall impact? And what's that exposure? Because that's going to start driving some automation about things like next best actions. How do we accelerate risk mitigation if we don't know where to start? I can create a list for you. It's going to be a very unmanageable list. But if I create a list and give you what that first action you should take as an organization based upon some of the intelligence that we've gathered, you now have a plan to go and attack it from an enterprise perspective. What's also important here is that now I'm rolling this up into a dashboard. And what's important about a dashboard is real-time enterprise risk posture management. Why that becomes important is because everybody's on the same playing field. Nobody's out on the sidelines looking in. Everybody's on the same playing field. They know what the next play is and they know how to take it forward. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to say, Philip, what do you think about this as your role as an assessor, especially in the world where you lived in, where maybe you were siloed in the past? How does this move us forward with really looking at or dealing with this, individual risk at an enterprise level?
Yeah, so again, I think it's very, very helpful to actually have a dashboard or a roll-up of all the enterprise risks that we uncovered throughout all these assessments that we've been conducted. I mean, it is very important to have that clear communication throughout across the board, throughout the entire organization, as we mentioned in the very beginning. And a good way to do that is having something like a dashboard to begin with that can show you, here are all your risk findings. Here is where all your data is hosted, right? Like here are the vendors that host their data in AWS here and so on. But you want to be able to really filter down into this risk register really and see where are my risks? How can I mitigate them? What are the due dates of them? When are they supposed to be remediated? It just helps overall with communication throughout the entire organization, getting the right people involved again, and have them to look at it and understand where's our risk and how do we go about it. And then And then it's really like about tracking as well, right? So we can see like in all our risk findings where they lay and when they're due, and follow up to make sure they're actually implemented. So I think having a dashboard like that just rolls up all these risks that you can clearly communicate throughout any organization, or throughout the organization with anyone applicable, is super important, because otherwise, how are you going to get these people involved? How are you going to get like anyone like from the upper management to like really understand where the true risk lays and how to mitigate them? So again, I think from previous experiences, it was kind of impossible to kind of like roll all that up into a dashboard and truly show the enterprise risk, and then communicate it internally and say like, here, take a look at this, and that's where we're at. But now with the SenseNet platform and our risk register and our dashboard, you have the opportunity to easily understand where that risk lays, and then even more importantly, be able to communicate that, take that, export it, show it to the right people, and say like, hey, you need to look at this. Here's where our risk lays, and here's what we're going to do about it. And again, that brings us to the next best actions to accelerate the risk mitigation and move forward in that direction, and have a plan on, okay, now we know what we need to do. Now we identified the risk, and here's the plan on how we remediate it. So very, very powerful tool and very important tool.
Yeah, and I think there's another side of this as well. It takes the friction away. If I think about my organization, and then this can go for any organization in general. If I have a dedicated risk register where I'm calculating next best action, which is going to help me minimize the most important risks in my organization, and everybody's involved in that process, and they're part of that process, it takes the friction away from what the roadmap is to getting the highest risks off the table for our org. Now, from an enterprise view, that's incredibly important, because we're all fighting for what we think's best for the organization. When we start to centralize and collaborate on this type of information, and once everybody's inside this process, we now know exactly where we need to go. And if we know exactly where we need to go, we can all focus on what part, or what is my responsibility now in getting us to that next level. I may not have any responsibility at all. I may be the next thing down on the list, but I know that at a certain point in time, I'm going to have to be engaged in this process to help remove risk from my enterprise. And that's why this becomes incredibly important. Removing that friction and getting people to understand where their responsibility lies, and then creating that roadmap for what we should be doing, incredibly important, powerful tool across the enterprise. Building upon all those areas that we talked about before, and really making cyber now the foundation for that enterprise risk program. See how we've flipped that around on you, right? We talked about cyber being a part of, now it's really helping to drive the enterprise risk program. So that's great. We got all this wonderful information. Everything's right at our fingertips. Risk register, know who's assigned to what. How do we start to communicate enterprise risk across the organization? It can't just be in a spreadsheet. It can't just be a bunch of tasks assigned to a single individual. It's really now about engaging the executives within your organization and connecting the dots for them. So understanding that there's going to be a lot of data here, drawing their attention to what matters most, communicating it at a very high level, but also something that's intuitive, not technical language, but business language. What is the impact to the organization if? Benchmarking as well. So taking it one step further, right? Understanding that I have an enterprise risk posture, but what does this look like in comparison to somebody else, other organization that's like size, like-minded, in the same business that I'm doing, and then cross-coordinating that across the organization again. So I'm going to throw this back to Philip. I love you, Philip. This is great. How have you been able to communicate as an assessor, enterprise risk posture, to those folks that we're doing assessments for today?
Yeah, so exactly like that, essentially, as you said. So having that dashboard really that shows you the result or really the status like of all these assessments that have been conducted so far, that you can show them, okay, listen, now we've conducted like X amount of assessments for your organization on these third parties, for example. But how does it roll up overall to your vendor portfolio, right? Like where are those high risks? Like what are these risk findings? How do we mitigate them? And for example, in a case of a breach, we want to make sure that we can easily and quickly identify any vendor that's been impacted or any area even any hosting server where the data might live in, to make sure that we can take action on it as soon as possible. So I feel like it's important to take a look at this risk register as well as the dashboard overall, reviewing it regularly, and really using it to communicate that throughout the entire organization. So for my role as a risk analyst with Sensenet, conducting risk assessments for different clients in a way of the MSP role, I would show it essentially to my clients on the call and walk them through it and review it and make sure they understand how to work with it, how to utilize it. And then I tell them like it's how important it is to communicate that throughout the entire organization. And so far I received a lot of really good feedback about that, how helpful it is to communicate with this tool throughout the entire organization where the problems are, and taking a look at it from, you know, the bigger picture essentially. So yeah, really positive feedback and really helpful tool as well.
Yeah, and I always like to follow up with something, an observation as well. So
Yeah.
when we talk about communicating enterprise risk at a high level, there also needs that ability to drill down into the detail. Because I think Philip said something very important there, and I want to make sure that that resonates and comes out again. When we think about risk, it could be internal, right? It could be financial, could be brand. When we start to get into third parties and understanding that risk posture, demonstrating that at a high level is fantastic. What about when we take it 2 steps down? What about the fourth party risk? Because we've seen some things take shape over the course of the last few months where third parties who are well-intentioned are using fourth party services, which have a direct impact to this first party that you are as an assessing organization. Being able to drill into this information from that high level down to very granular, incredibly important to understand your totality of risk posture. Now, me, as an executive, I want it in an intuitive way in some non-technical language, but I want to be able to drill in as well. So simple click-throughs to get me to the heart of the data so that I can make informed decisions about where we go next, incredibly important. And if you think about how we've built that path today through these 10 best practices, these 10 practice areas, it really starts to give you that pure visibility about your enterprise risk program, tying in cyber into the enterprise and really driving the enterprise risk program through the use of cyber. So with that said, I'm going to advance to the next slide and thank you for your participation. Thank you for listening to us. Sorry about the hiccups up front, but we worked through them and I think we did a damn good job working through them. So I'm going to take a pause there. I'm going to ask Saul to come back on and see if there's been any questions that have been submitted through the chat.
Thank you guys, and fantastic work. Thank you, everybody. There's definitely some questions that came in. So why don't we go ahead and go through those. First, 1 second. I'll go ahead and stop the share and go ahead and run through those. What are best practices for reaching out to subject matter experts across the enterprise?
That's a great question. Again, so I'm going to frame this from my perspective, and then I'm going to let Philip throw his 2 cents in here as well. You know, I firmly believe in that you have to get everybody involved in this process to understand where ownership is. So whether that is having a committee that's dedicated to risk to really start to flesh out who those subject matter experts should be, so that way there's accountability that's held within the organization as well. So that risk committee can meet on a regular basis, a regular cadence, and then really start to dive into those workflows to solve for those enterprise risk problems. That would be the best practice for me from looking at it from a very high level. Now, Philip, I'm sure you have some other best practices when it comes time to this about getting them engaged in that process.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of have that initial conversation right internally and say like, okay, who are those expert or subject matter experts that should be involved in this process, as you pointed out, and then yeah, it's just like a matter of like assigning the right questions to them, getting that input back, and streamline the process. So I think best practice for subject matter experts is really just having that internal conversation, telling them about the process, have them learn about the process, and then have them chime in, have the correct point of contacts for these roles, and have them participate and all work together to resolve that one issue.
Thank you, guys. Folks, just as a reminder, the slides will be shared with you afterwards. I had a couple questions around CEU credits. When you get those slides in the email, you'll also have instructions on how to receive your CEU credits. This is a CEU eligible content, so you will all be eligible, and you'll see instructions in that follow-up email. We have another question here. Can you tell us a little more about MOVEit and recommendations and insights to mitigate that vulnerability? Timely question.
Yeah, very timely question. We don't have enough time to go through the whole thing, but I'll give you my best take and approach, right? So for those of you who don't know, MOVEit is a technology that allows organizations to transfer files, right? So it's software based. This most recent incident that happened back in June, there was notice of a 0-day vulnerability in the MOVEit software. Now, where this becomes a real problem is that most organizations who work with third-party vendors may not have known that they were using MOVEit to move their data files, right? So if you're not aware of it right out of the gate, obviously it doesn't resonate with you, but for those that were actively using it and saw it get exploited, they knew right away that there was a problem. Here's where the downstream trickle effect takes place. Because you're not aware that you're a third party using a fourth party vendor like MOVEit to move your data files, it becomes a much bigger risk to your organization. So again, how do we start to solve this? I'm not going to go into the details about what the vulnerability was, but if you think about this from a CISO's perspective, right? I think understanding first and foremost who your third parties are and what your fourth party risk looks like really starts to make a difference. This is where I can start to think about that last dashboard that we showed you. If I can start to drill into data related to my vendors, related to my risks, I should be able to see where that fourth party risk lies. So how do I get to that point? Well, I'll give you 6 tips here. First and foremost, a vendor inventory. You got to have one. It's got to be comprehensive. It's got to be up to date. This is a tough task in very large organizations that may still be working in silos. It's a tough task. I won't say it's an easy task to do, but you got to start somewhere. You got to have that vendor inventory and you got to have it up to date, because products and services that you use today, there may be vulnerabilities that you can determine, but what about the ones that you can't, right? Hard to determine which vendors might be affected by those specific vulnerabilities. Getting all that information in one place and managing it as a portfolio, incredibly important, right? Vendor communication next. Even if you know who your vendors are you having an active dialogue with them? It can be difficult to communicate effectively with your vendors, particularly if you think about things like MOVEit in urgent situations. I got to have this problem solved like right now, yesterday. Not all vendors may have the necessary processes in place to have that communication. So as you're managing your inventory and portfolio, create that communication channel with them, whether it's digitally, whether it's over the phone, but just have it established. Assessing those vendors. Everybody's affected differently by that vulnerability, but understanding that they had the vulnerability is key. So assessing your vendors to understand the versions of the software, what is actually in the box that you're using at the end of the day, how significant are the challenges to get that problem solved. That's that next phase. You got to have that visibility, right? And then finally, understanding the risk of that visibility. So you know the vendor has the problem, they're using the affected software. What does that mean to my organization from a risk perspective? Well, if I had a third party using a fourth party like MOVEit, but they were just moving files that had no identifiable information, where's the real risk there to my organization? Not all risk is equal. Understanding that risk.
No.
After you've understood that risk, have a mitigation strategy. So based upon your risk assessment, based upon the assessment of the vendor, really develop and implement that mitigation strategy. And that could involve working with the vendor to patch the software, moving to a new piece of software, or moving away from that vendor altogether. That's always going to be an option. And then finally, the last piece of the puzzle, this is a life cycle, right? So ongoing vendor management. It's never going to be a one-time problem. What we saw with Log4j 2 years ago, what we've seen with MOVEit and other things that have, percolated through this landscape, it's not going to go away. New vulnerabilities are going to continuously crop up. They're going to be discovered. There needs to be a robust process in place for your organization to not only manage your vendor relationships, but also to respond to these types of situations in the future. So, I say 6 easy tasks. Nothing in life is ever easy, but it's a starting point, and get started today. Do not wait till tomorrow.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Philip. And thank you, everybody, for attending. We're now at time. We'll follow up with answers to questions. And remember to take a look at your calendar for August 9th. That is the next part of the series. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.